Hello and welcome to Annual Reviews Audio, part of the conversation series from Annual Reviews, where insightful research begins. I'm your host, Anna Rasquat-Paz. In each episode of our show, we feature top scientists in fields ranging from astrophysics to sociology. Today I talked to Aaron Bernstein, Associate Director and Program Director of Climate, Energy and Health at the Harvard School of Public Health. He is also an instructor in pediatrics at the Harvard Medical School and a physician in medicine at the Children's Hospital in Boston. Dr. Bernstein wrote the article Biological Diversity in Public Health for the 2014 Annual Review of Public Health. Dr. Bernstein, welcome.
Delighted to be here.
All right, so the first thing I'd like to do is to introduce your article and tell us why biodiversity is important to our health.
Well, that's a great question to start with because biodiversity has not traditionally been a subject that concerns public health, but that is changing. Biodiversity is a term that refers to the variety of life on Earth. It's the sum total of all the genes, species, and ecosystems on the planet. And in almost every conceivable way, it's the diversity of life that makes possible the pillars of what keeps us healthy, be it the air we breathe, the food we eat, or the medicines we take. And so as there has been a great shift in life on Earth, especially in the past 100 years, and in the diversity of life, it's become increasingly important to understand what's at stake for human health when it comes to changes or the outright loss of biological diversity.
Let's look at the slides that you've chosen to illustrate your article. The first slide we have is a pie chart looking at medicines approved by the FDA. So what does it show us?
Perhaps the most concrete way that people will understand how the diversity of life may influence their health is in medication. So many people will know, for example, that aspirin comes from the bark of the willow tree, that some blood pressure medicines like the ACE inhibitors or the beta block derive from other species. But I think there's a general perception that in drug discovery today that science and biomedical science is relying ever more on human intuition to design drugs. And that's certainly true. And so-called rational drug design is incredibly important to the discovery of new drugs. But I think it's also important to look at the new drugs that are coming onto market and understand where they came from. And that's what this pie graph shows. If you look at all of the newly approved medicines by the United States Food and Drug Administration between 1981 and 2010, just over half would really not exist if there weren't some organism producing either the exact molecule that became a drug or a very near relative of it that provided the inspiration for scientists to develop it further into a drug. And I think that's a crucial point because even today, with all that science has to offer, we still rely heavily upon nature. The other point that's important to note about this is that this is really the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of uncertainty as to drug development and what molecules, as promising as they may in fact be licensed for use. The fact that we rely upon biodiversity for medicines today is a very important piece of this interface of biodiversity and health. And it also is important to underscore the point that there's a tremendous amount of information to be learned by exploring nature and its molecules about how our own bodies work in health and disease.
Right, and then you have a couple of slides that show the major classes of antibiotics.
You know, there's this 55% roughly of new drugs, but it turns out that for certain classes of drugs, anti-cancer agents and antibiotics in particular, that the reliance of medicine upon nature is yet greater. There are about 14 classes of antibiotics available to physicians today in the United States. And of those 14, which are illustrated here, 10 of those classes would not exist if we hadn't looked at nature to provide them for us. And that really isn't terribly surprising because most of the antibiotics we use were designed by microbial organisms, bacteria and fungi, to ward off their competitors. And so we have harnessed that ability to make antibiotics. I think it's also important to note that bacteria and fungi that produce these substances almost never produce them one at a time. They often will produce them in combinations, and they've been duking it out for a long time, greater than humans have been around. So microbial life on Earth predates animals by billions of years. So there's a head start in understanding how microbes fight each other off by examining the compounds they use themselves.
So next we have an image of the seed bank in Svalbard in Norway. So what is this and why is it important?
Yeah, so another critical interface between biodiversity and health is what biodiversity means to food production. And the picture here is of the Svalbard seed bank in Norway, which has in its vast storehouse, which is kept at about minus 18 degrees Celsius in the permafrost, about 800,000 seeds of food crops, largely. And that is done to serve as essentially an insurance policy against the loss of diversity in food crops for humans. It became very clear starting in the 90s that as the human enterprise expanded over greater territory, the economy globalized, and climate change really started to rear its head, that there was an increasing probability that there could be a situation in which we might lose a specific strain crop that could be extremely valuable in the future. And so the seed bank, among others, was established to store this germplasm, this biodiversity, that, for instance, could be used in a future world in which we need much more heat-resistant crops or salt-resistant crops, or potentially crops that were more tolerant to heavy metal pollution, among other considerations. And this is one of the critical pieces of biodiversity and its relation to health, in that it is the diversity of life on Earth that allows us to grow crops and the variety of crops that are essential to human nutrition.
Okay, next we're looking at a photograph of large tree seedlings. So what does this tell us?
So this is another interface between biodiversity and health that pertains to food production. I will often ask students, how much does it take to grow an apple? And the answer, of course, is it's not one. And so while we have the seed banks like Svalbard, I think it's a bit misleading to believe that if we just have a seed for a specific crop, that we will have enough to sustain the food resources that we need. And this picture of the large tree seedling is designed to show the root system. Now, you'll see in this picture that going into the soil, there are some white strands and some brown strands. Well, the brown strands are the plant's roots, and the white strands, you'll see if you look closely, have some white nodules on them. And those white filaments are what are known as mycorrhizal fungi. The mycorrhizal fungi are a group of fungi that have the greatest, most extensive symbiosis with plants on Earth. They have co-evolved with plants, came onto land 400 million years ago. And the relationship between the fungus and the plant is designed to have the plant make sugars through photosynthesis and deliver those sugars to the fungus. And in return, the fungus is able to deliver, among other things, phosphorus to plants, some essential minerals. There's also evidence that mycorrhizal fungi may protect plants against, for example, heavy metals. So this is an enormously important relationship between plants and, in this case, fungus, that speaks to the importance of other species, and in this case a subterranean species, to food production. Of course, there are many other relationships among species that are critical to food production, and we're going to turn to one of those next when we talk about bats.
Yeah, so that's great transition to the next slide. We're looking at a bat with white nose syndrome.
Bats are pollinators, along with what are more familiar organisms such as honeybees. There are thousands of pollinator species on the planet. For human food production, it is largely the produce that we eat that requires a pollinator, fruits and vegetables. And we are witnessing some rather striking reductions in pollinators, particularly bees, but also bats. And this picture shows a bat that's been infected with the white nose syndrome. A white nose syndrome is a fungus known as Geomyces destructans. It's killing off bats by the millions in the United States, likely going to lead to the extinction of one bat species in the United States. It's been introduced, we believe, from Europe into caves in the United States. Bats are not just pollinators, they also eat insects. And it's been estimated that in the United States, bats provide around $3.7 billion per year of pest control services for free. We spend in the United States about $4.5 billion on pesticides. So the services that these bats are providing are essentially equivalent to the services that we're substituting for them and other creatures that eat insects by spraying chemicals which may have unwanted side effects. And again, if you think about the ability of mycorrhizal fungi to deliver phosphorus to plants, it's been estimated that, for example, that in a citrus you can have about 500 pounds per acre of phosphorus delivered by mycorrhizal fungi to the citrus trees. And when we lose that, we have to give more synthetic fertilizers. And with bats, with the white nose syndrome, we are potentially forcing ourselves to spray more chemicals to replace the service that bats were providing for free.
So we're going to move on to the next slide and look at extinctions per 1,000 species per millennium. And I'm looking at this, and I'd love for you to explain to me what is so striking about it.
We've talked about a few of the interfaces between biodiversity and health, for medicines, for food. We could have talked about infectious diseases. If you want to know more about that, you can read the article. And what this graph shows is that as we come to understand more and more what's at stake for our health with diversity, we're also learning that biodiversity is imperiled today in a way that hasn't happened in a very long time. And that's what's shown here. So on the left of this purple, we have evidence from the fossil record of the rate at which went extinct before humans were around. And if you compare those rates of extinction to present rates of extinction, we're seeing rates roughly 100 times what occurred. And looking forward, it seems clear that rates of species extinction are going to be much higher, specifically because of climate change, which is disrupting all kinds of relationships among species and forcing some species to lose their habitat that is climate sensitive. So this is a trend that's very concerning, given what we know about why biodiversity matters to health.
Yeah, and next we're going to look at a history of mass extinctions.
Right. So this graph shows Earth's past 5 great mass extinctions. So in the history of life on Earth, we really know about 5 great extinctions of life going back over 400 million years ago to the late Ordovician, where about over half of the genera on Earth were lost. The most recent extinction event was about 65 million years ago. That's when an asteroid struck the Earth in the Gulf of Mexico and caused a huge cloud to cover the Earth and about 50% of genera, including the dinosaurs. And it was in that void that humans evolved. We were one of the organisms to fill that ecological niche. Species lost today put us on par with the last great extinction event. And there have been some scientists who have suggested that we are living right now in the midst of the Earth's 6th great extinction event. And I say that not to cause dismay, although it is somewhat dismaying, but I think it's easy for people to look outside and see a beautiful park and birds and whatever may be in your backyard and say, what could possibly be wrong with life on Earth? But I think it's really important to look at the science here and understand that we are in fact living in one of the great simplifications of the biosphere ever realized. Of course, the difference between those past extinctions and the present extinction is that humans have the ability to affect what happens immensely.
So the last slide I'm looking at is titled The Final Common Pathway.
Yeah. So the major causes of species loss and biodiversity loss more broadly today are habitat loss, which is pictured on this slide, primarily, and then a slew of other causes: invasive species, pollution, overharvesting, and infection. So infection, we talked about white nose syndrome. There's a fungus also killing off large numbers of amphibians. Primates in West Africa are being killed by Ebola virus. Lots of examples there. Overharvesting, the main example today is overharvesting of seafood from the world's oceans. A large percentage of the world's fish have been consumed, and the sustainability of many fisheries in the world is really in doubt. Pollution, there is pollution that has been affecting species around the world. Sometimes it's specific local pollution, such as what happened with oil spills in Alaska or in the Gulf of Mexico, and sometimes it's more global pollution. So we see, for example, in places like Svalbard, where the sea bank is, life being contaminated with persistent pollutants that were produced in the United States. Invasive species, although the picture is small, the picture under invasive species shows kudzu, which is a vine that, quote, ate the South, end quote, and the South being the South of the United States. This is a vine that was intentionally introduced into the South at the roadsides to prevent erosion. It turns out that the vine was completely adept at overrunning everything in its sight. And in this picture, it's overgrowing trees and posts. So invasive species are another major cause. But again, the lion's share today of biodiversity loss is by habitat loss, largely deforestation, and that is largely for agricultural purposes, and particularly grazing of cattle, as well as in Southeast Asia for the plantation of palm oil. But eventually, climate change is likely going to pass all of the above as the leading driver of biodiversity loss. I think it's a critically important point to recognize that all changes to the environment, be they infections, overharvesting, pollution, invasives, or habitat loss, or even climate change, they all ultimately exert their effects upon the living world. And so biodiversity really is the final common pathway of all environmental change. Now, if you look at this slide, you'll see that all of these factors we can do something about. And particularly when it comes to the two big hitters, habitat loss and climate change, we can have an immense influence on changing the course of these problems, whether it be deforestation or the amount of greenhouse gases that went into the atmosphere. And so what's amazing about living in the present moment is that science has told us enough about how our health depends on biodiversity, about the state of biodiversity at present as it compares to the past, and also about what we can do to dramatically manage the future of life on Earth. And so there's a really extraordinary opportunity to protect life on Earth today, if for no other reason, and there are many reasons to do this, for the sake of the health of people around the world.
Going from this last point, I just want to conclude this interview by asking you, who should read this article? It's important enough that it sounds like, you know, your audience should be very broad. So who do you think should read this article in priority?
Well, I would be thrilled if it gained attention in the world of public health, among public health experts, to understand how the areas that public health has traditionally focused on, be it infectious diseases, nutrition, environmental health, etc., how those disciplines interface with biodiversity, and why this issue of biodiversity loss is so critically important for all those areas. I think it would also be relevant to people who are ecologists, because ecologists often think about how changes to ecosystems matter to health, but they don't often go, in my view, far enough to understand really what is at stake for human well-being. But again, I think your point is well taken. This article is written to be accessible by anyone. And I think if we're really to do what's necessary to protect biodiversity, everybody has to know what's at stake for their own health. And my hope is that this article, in some small way, will make that possible.
Well, Dr. Bernstein, thank you so very much for your time today.
You're most welcome, Anna. Thanks for the opportunity to do this.